Carnegie Hall throbbed with the promise of an unforgettable night. Luna Vance, 17 and a cello prodigy, felt the metallic chill of the strings beneath her fingers as the orchestra's hum enveloped her. She wasn't just a musician, Luna was the melody, each note an extension of her perfectionist soul. A student at the renowned Juilliard, she lived and breathed music, and the final performance of the year, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, was the pinnacle of her dedication. During that dress rehearsal, the tension was palpable. The conductor, a meticulous German, demanded absolute perfection. Luna, focused, felt a shiver run down her spine. It wasn't the chill of the air conditioning, nor the anxiety of the performance. It was something deeper, an icy whisper that infiltrated her mind. She tried to ignore it, focusing on the score, but the sound of the woodwind seemed to distort, the strings went out of tune in her perception, and Beethoven's glorious melody transformed into a lament. Suddenly, the room dissolved. It was no longer Carnegie Hall, but an oppressive, dark, and claustrophobic void. The vision came like lightning, vivid and undeniable, the stage, once grand, now writhed under an invisible weight. Steel beams groaned, wood cracked with a nauseating sound. The red velvet curtain, which had promised a spectacle, detached in slow motion, revealing the imminent chaos. The musicians, once immersed in their art, now screamed, their instruments crushed. Luna watched the cello at her feet be pulverized by a massive block, and the ceiling, a mosaic of gilded adornments, collapsed in a shower of dust and debris, sealing everyone's fate. The symphony's final sound merged with the crash of the collapse, a macabre chorus that echoed in her soul. Luna gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cold sweat trickled down her forehead, and she was back in the rehearsal, the cello firm in her hands, the conductor still leading with surgical precision. But the vision, it had been so real, so palpable. She looked at the stage, at the support beams, with a newfound terror. The orchestra chairs, once an invitation to art, now seemed like deadly traps. Her mind raced. It was a premonition. No, it couldn't be. But the feeling of dread was overwhelming, undeniable. She needed to act, to warn, to prevent the disaster. But how? Who would believe her, a music student with a crazy vision? Yet, time was running out. She had to try, before the melody of death found its final note. Chaos erupted backstage at Carnegie Hall. Luna, her heart still racing from the vision, tried to scream, to warn everyone, but her voice seemed caught in her throat. Her mind processed the sequence of events from the premonition, the collapse, the darkness, the screams. With a sudden, almost primal instinct, she dropped her cello and ran. Not for the main exit, not where the other musicians were starting to gather in confusion, but for a hidden service door she had spent months discovering in the theater's labyrinthine corridors. It was an escape route few knew, used only for trash disposal and minor deliveries. As Luna squeezed through the narrow door, the ground beneath her feet trembled. A deep, guttural sound reverberated throughout the building, like a sleeping monster awakening. She heard sharp screams, the shattering of glass, the dragging of metal. The air filled with dust and the acrid smell of pulverized concrete. She didn't look back. She ran down the dark alley, the echo of the main crash ringing in her ears. A wave of nausea overwhelmed her, not from the physical exertion, but from the knowledge of what had just happened. Minutes later, slick with sweat and grime, Luna emerged onto a side street. Fire truck sirens already tore through the Manhattan night, and the intermittent flash of emergency lights painted the buildings. The main street in front of Carnegie Hall was a pandemonium. Police cars blocked traffic, ambulances sped closer, and a curious, horrified crowd began to form. The iconic building, once a symbol of art and culture, was now a pile of rubble, with part of its facade collapsed and a cloud of dust still hanging over it. The Ninth Symphony had been brutally and tragically interrupted. Amidst the chaos, Luna spotted familiar faces. Jeremy, the young and promising trumpeter she always competed with for solos, stood pale, his trumpet still in his hands, as if it were an anchor in the whirlwind. Chloe, the principal violinist, with her vibrant red hair, was clutching a stage technician, trembling uncontrollably. And, to Luna's surprise, Maestro Steiner himself, though visibly shaken and with his suit dusty, was speaking vehemently to a fire official, his baton still clutched in his hand. They had escaped. Each with their own story of how, by a hair's breadth, they weren't on stage when hell broke loose. Luna. Thank God. Jeremy's voice was choked, and he rushed to embrace her, an awkward, relief-filled hug. What was that? I was getting a glass of water backstage and, suddenly, the world shook. For a second, I thought it was the end. Chloe approached, her eyes red and swollen. I had forgotten my violin stand in the musician's lounge. I went to get it, and when I came back, the stage was gone. She shook her head, disbelieving. It's a miracle we're alive. None of them mentioned Luna's premonition. It was as if the memory of what she had said minutes earlier had been erased by the brutal reality. They spoke of luck, coincidences, small delays that pulled them away from the epicenter of the tragedy. The media, which was already arriving in droves, confirmed Luna's suspicions. Reporters with microphones and cameras swarmed, their flashes illuminating the scene of destruction. Breaking news broadcasts showed aerial images of the collapsed Carnegie Hall, with audio from shocked witnesses. Structural failure, lack of maintenance, unthinkable tragedy, were the terms used to describe the event. But for Luna, those words rang hollow. Structural failure didn't explain the clear vision, the sound of the symphony blending with the collapse. The terror she felt before the rehearsal intensified, turning into a growing paranoia. She began to observe the other survivors, to analyze every movement. Something was wrong. This wasn't a simple failure. It was as if an invisible force had pulled the strings, orchestrating each piece for the tragedy to materialize, and she, Jeremy, Chloe, and Maestro Steiner were mere pawns who, by a slip, escaped the first move. But the game, Luna felt, was far from over. The days following the Carnegie Hall collapse were a blur of incessant news and somber vigils. The official theory spoke of structural fatigue and poor oversight, a narrative that reassured most but rang hollow in Luna's ears. She spent hours online, compulsively searching for any detail, any anomaly that would confirm her premonition. Jeremy, Chloe, and Maestro Steiner also seemed affected, but in a different way. They dealt with grief, with trauma, while Luna lived with the chilling certainty of a pending threat. The first break in the apparent normalcy came a week later. The news spread through the orchestra survivors' message groups: Maestro Steiner had died. Not as a result of the accident, but in a bizarre and unbelievable, domestic accident. Luna was in her small Manhattan apartment, sifting through the latest news on the collapse investigation, when her phone rang. It was Jeremy, his voice thick with shock. The maestro, he's gone. It was at home, on the Upper West Side. They said he was fixing a light fixture in his music room ceiling. Standing on a piano bench. The fixture fell, and he fell awkwardly. A sharp point from a music stand he himself collected, fatal. Luna's blood ran cold. A music stand. The melody of death. It wasn't just an accident. It was a pattern. She remembered the premonition. The ceiling collapsing, the instruments crushed. The maestro, who had escaped death by being in a safe area of the stage, was now reached by it in his own sanctuary. She called Chloe immediately, who was in tears. It doesn't make sense, Luna. The maestro was so meticulous. He'd never do something so careless. And a music stand? It's like, it was waiting for him. Chloe's voice was laced with terror and disbelief. Luna felt a knot in her stomach. Chloe, listen. I know what I saw. That premonition, it wasn't just about Carnegie Hall. It's bigger than that. Death, it's coming for us. There was silence on the other end of the line. Chloe sniffled. Luna, please. It's grief. We're all traumatized. It's a tragedy, yes, but it's not a curse. The maestro was old, maybe he was distracted. Distracted? With a sharp music stand? On top of a piano bench, in the middle of his music room? Luna retorted, her voice rising. Chloe, the stage collapsed. Now the maestro dies in an accident that sounds straight out of a bad movie. Don't you see the pattern? Chloe, despite her own distress, couldn't see what Luna saw so clearly. It's just a horrible coincidence, Luna. We need to support each other, not invent ghosts. Her voice was firm, but there was an underlying tremor of fear she tried to disguise. But for Luna, there was no disguise. Maestro Steiner's accident was irrefutable proof. The sequence of events, the way death seemed to weave a web, using elements from the environment to reach its victim. It was as if the melody of death, once silent, had now found its first dark note, and it wouldn't stop until the symphony was complete. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that the maestro was just the beginning. And the list of survivors was short. Maestro Steiner's death solidified Luna's certainty that the premonition was much more than an isolated glimpse. It wasn't about Carnegie Hall, it was about death itself, a patient and methodical entity that now seemed to be correcting errors in its macabre symphony. She knew she had to understand the pattern before it was too late for Jeremy and Chloe. The day after the maestro's funeral, a somber, grief-filled ceremony where whispered conversations about the bizarre accident were muffled by formal rituals, Luna plunged headfirst into her investigation. Her small apartment transformed into an operations center. The walls were covered with makeshift diagrams, photos of the survivors, and newspaper clippings of the collapse. Red string connected names to dates and accidents. Think, Luna, think, she murmured to herself, scribbling frantically in a notepad. The premonition showed the collapse. The maestro escaped, and died by an object linked to music, in his music room. He was fixing something on the ceiling. Ceiling. The same element that collapsed in the theater. She tried calling Jeremy and Chloe, but they were inconsolable, still caught in the denial and grief stage. Jeremy answered once, his voice choked, and just repeated that Luna needed to process what had happened. Chloe didn't answer her calls, probably exhausted by her conspiracy theory. Their disbelief frustrated her, but also fueled her. While reviewing photos of the destroyed stage, Luna had a flash. In the rehearsal, the orchestra was arranged in a specific way. The maestro at the podium, cellos to the right, brass behind, violins to the left. She pulled up an old Carnegie Hall blueprint she'd found online. Okay, the vision was of everyone dying on stage. Who escaped and where were they? She marked Jeremy's position, he was backstage, getting water. Chloe, off stage, in the musicians' lounge. Maestro Steiner, at the podium, but had stepped out for a moment before the full collapse to speak with a technician. Luna's mind worked feverishly. Jeremy was out, getting water. Water. Hydration. The maestro was fixing a light fixture on the ceiling, near sheet music and the piano. His death was precise. Direct. It seems like a consequence of his environment or something that surrounded him at the moment of his near death at the theater. Then, panic hit her. She knew who was next. Jeremy. Jeremy, the vibrant trumpeter, passionate about extreme sports and always with a water bottle in hand. If the pattern was that death corrected its failure with a method linked to the circumstance of escape, Jeremy was in imminent danger. He escaped because he was getting water. What if death reached him in a way related to water? Luna called Jeremy repeatedly, without success. Text messages. No answer. The tension in her chest was a string stretched to its limit. She hailed a taxi, Jeremy's Brooklyn apartment address flashing in her mind. The clock seemed to speed up. Arriving at the old brick building, Luna rushed to Jeremy's apartment. The door was ajar. A strange sound, a muffled gurgle, came from inside. "Jeremy," she screamed, pushing the door open. The scene froze her. Jeremy was on the bathroom floor, his body convulsing. The bathtub was overflowing, and water spilled out, forming a puddle around him. A small electric toaster, still plugged in, floated dangerously in the water. He had tried to plug in his shaver near the tub, perhaps after a bath, and the toaster, which he used to dry damp socks, one of his strange habits, had fallen into the water. "No!" Luna screamed, desperate. She rushed to unplug the toaster from the wall socket, but it was too late. Jeremy's body stopped moving. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, life draining from them. Luna knelt beside him, her hands trembling. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the floodwater. Death could not be cheated. She had failed. And the sight of Jeremy, inert, was the most painful proof that the dark symphony would continue, note by note, until the end. Fear was no longer a premonition, it was a brutal certainty. Jeremy's death shattered Luna's last barrier of denial. There was no longer any room for doubt. Death was hunting the Carnegie Hall survivors, weaving an intricate and cruel trap for each one. With Jeremy out of the equation, only Chloe, the principal violinist, remained. Luna knew time was running out and that Chloe's life, and perhaps her own, depended on deciphering death's complete pattern. Her apartment became a battlefield of theories. Photos of the Carnegie Hall stage, articles about strange accidents, theater blueprints, everything was spread out and connected by red wool threads. Luna scoured databases of unusual accidents, old newspaper archives, and online discussion forums about inexplicable events. She was obsessed. The maestro escaped by being slightly away from the podium, talking to a technician. He died from an object linked to music, in his musical environment, from a fall related to the ceiling, the same element that collapsed in the theater, Luna murmured to herself, writing on a whiteboard. Jeremy escaped by getting water backstage. He died from electrocution in water, in the bathroom, an environment linked to water. The toaster, a domestic item, but one he used to dry damp socks, meaning it was indirectly linked to water. The pattern was grotesquely clear. Death replicated the circumstance of the escape, but in a fatally distorted and symbolic way, using elements from the survivor's environment or everyday objects lethally. Chloe, Luna finally managed to reach her after hours of trying. Chloe was home, her voice faint, still in shock from Jeremy's loss. "Chloe, you have to listen to me. I've figured out the pattern. It's real. Death is following us. Jeremy, it wasn't a normal accident." Chloe, though still skeptical, seemed more shaken than before. "What are you talking about, Luna? What do you mean a pattern? We're all going crazy. Think about how you escaped Carnegie Hall." Luna insisted, the urgency in her voice almost hysterical. "You went to get your violin stand in the musician's lounge, right? Off stage, but inside the theater." A tense silence hung on the line. "Yes, so death is going to use something related to your escape, to your environment, to get you." Luna explained, trying to keep calm. "The maestro, Jeremy, all of them. You were getting the stand. Stands are made of metal. What if it tries to reach you with something metallic? Or in a place related to music that isn't the stage, but where you kept your violin?" Chloe finally showed a glimmer of genuine fear. "Metal, what do you mean?" "My apartment is full of metal things, Luna. And the musician's lounge is sealed off. We need to think of how to break the cycle, how to trick it." Luna proposed, her brain working a mile a minute. She remembered stories and legends that mentioned the idea of passing the turn or switching places with death. What if you get rid of everything that connected you to that stand? Or the violin? Or even try to skip your turn? I don't know, but we need to try something drastic. The two began to investigate frantically, but this time, together. They scoured esoteric forums, books on folklore and curse-breaking rituals, no matter how absurd they seemed. One theory caught Luna's attention. Some cultures believed that tricking fate involved a complete renunciation of the object or circumstance that triggered the pursuit. "Chloe, you have to get rid of your violin," Luna suggested. "Not just sell it, but destroy it. It's your strongest link to that moment's escape. Maybe, if death doesn't have the tool to reach you, it will skip to the next victim." Chloe hesitated. Her violin was an old Stradivarius, a family heirloom, her most precious possession. "Destroy my violin? Luna, are you crazy? It's my life. Your life or your death, Chloe. Choose." Luna retorted, her voice firm. Reluctantly, Chloe agreed. The two went to an abandoned junkyard, far from curious eyes. Chloe, in tears, raised the violin. With a rusty hammer Luna had found, she delivered the first blow. The sound of the noble wood cracking was a painful echo, almost a scream. The second blow crushed the soundbox. The violin, once a voice of beauty, now lay in pieces. There was a brief moment of relief. A false sense of security. Had it worked? Had death been tricked? Days passed without incident. Luna was exhausted, but hopeful. Maybe death really could be deceived. It was then that Luna's phone rang. It was the police. Chloe's body had been found. She was in her apartment. The cause of death? A bizarre accident with her washing machine, which had overflowed and short-circuited, electrocuting her as she tried to unplug it. The washing machine had come loose from its pipes, rolling and crushing a piece of the metal shelf where Chloe kept her sheet music and old photos. Luna fell to her knees. Not the stand. But the metal. And the water. And the reference to music and the home of her sheet music. Death hadn't cared about the destroyed violin. It had found a new, crueler and more ironic way to complete its pattern. The washing machine, with its internal metal parts, was the new instrument. Death could not be tricked. It didn't follow predictable rules, only its own relentless destiny. And now, Luna was the only survivor. The panic surged, transforming into a cold, paralyzing terror. She knew she was next. Chloe's death was a devastating blow, but ironically, it solidified Luna's resolve. There was no one left to save. The race against death was now a solitary battle, and Luna refused to be just the next victim on its grim list. The panic from before gave way to a calculating coolness. If death adapted, so would she. Luna isolated herself completely. She turned off her phone, cut off all contact with the outside world. Her apartment, once a sanctuary of sheet music and premonition diagrams, became a bunker. She knew death didn't care where she was or what she was doing, but rather how it would reach her, in a perverse twisting of her original escape method. "I escaped Carnegie Hall by running through a hidden service door, a quick and unexpected escape route," Luna murmured to the empty walls. "I fled through improvisation, through agility. So, will death come for me through something sudden, unexpected, linked to speed or escape?" She tried to predict. Could it be a high-speed car crash? An unexpected fall? An object falling from above? Luna began to avoid everything that could be an accident. She stopped using the subway, fearing a sudden derailment. She avoided walking on crowded sidewalks, fearing a runaway cyclist. The paranoia was exhausting, but Luna embraced it as an ally. She devised a daring, almost suicidal plan. If death manifested through a perverse pattern of escapes, Luna would try to trick it by putting herself in a situation of non-escape, or a flight so deliberately controlled that death would have no way to subvert it. Her idea was simple in its madness. She would lock herself in a place where escape was impossible, or where the escape was so premeditated that it would negate the element of surprise that death seemed to use. Luna chose the safest and, paradoxically, the most claustrophobic place she could imagine, a high-tech security vault in a bank in downtown New York. Not an ordinary bank locker, but a fortified, fireproof, and collapse-proof room, used to store works of art and valuable documents. She had researched it. To access it, multiple passwords, biometrics, and the accompaniment of a manager were required. Once inside, the door sealed with tons of steel, with no chance of opening without the correct procedures. She made the arrangements, fabricating a complex story about a priceless musical manuscript that needed to be stored with maximum security. The day arrived. With her heart pounding, but her mind strangely calm, Luna entered the vault. The room was small, lined with cold metal, with a single armchair and an overwhelming silence. It was the opposite of the vibrant Carnegie Hall stage. "There's nowhere to run here, Death," she whispered, her voice echoing faintly. "No surprise, no improvisation. You can't get me if I'm not trying to escape, if I'm already trapped." The bank manager activated the security mechanisms. The heavy sound of the door closing, with multiple clicks and the hiss of compressed air, was deafening. Luna was alone. Completely isolated. Hours passed. The silence was so absolute that Luna could hear her own heartbeat. She waited for any sign, any anomaly. Nothing. Not a creak, not a shadow, not a shiver. The strategy, she thought, seemed to work. Death fed on surprise, on the human reaction to danger. Without the chance of an unexpected escape, perhaps it had no opening. Night fell. Luna's plan was to spend 24 hours in the vault, theorizing that Death would have a period of time to act before skipping to the next opportunity. As the hours progressed, a strange sense of peace washed over her. She had survived. She had broken the cycle. When the bank manager, promptly, opened the vault door the next morning, the light that entered blinded Luna for an instant. She rose from the armchair, swaying slightly, but with a victorious smile. She had done it. She was alive. The manager looked at her with a surprised expression. "Miss Vance, are you all right? Your face, it's a bit red." Luna raised her hand to her face. She felt a strange warmth. There was something in the air of the vault, a smell she couldn't identify in her previous panic. A sweet, yet acrid smell. She had survived, for now. The feeling of security was intoxicating. Luna walked out of the bank, taking a deep breath of fresh New York air. The city seemed brighter, more alive. She had been mistaken. Death, at last, had been fooled. Months dragged on, turning into almost a year. Luna Vance tried to pick up the pieces of her life. The Carnegie Hall incident, though still a topic of civil engineering study, had faded from public memory. She had moved from New York, seeking refuge in a small town in rural Vermont, far from the crowds and skyscrapers that could collapse at any moment. She secured a scholarship to a local conservatory, where the pace was slower, the stage smaller, and the symphony more intimate. At first, the peace was almost palpable. Luna spent her days practicing her cello, which she had replaced after the tragedy. She avoided large crowds and old structures. She slept better, free from vivid nightmares of collapses and accidents. She believed she had tricked Death, that her cunning act of locking herself in the bank vault had broken the cycle. A bitter victory, yes, but a victory nonetheless. However, a subtle sequence of coincidences began to manifest. Small things, almost imperceptible, that sent a familiar chill down her spine. A newspaper note at the local bakery mentioned material fatigue in a nearby bridge. A radio program reported the crash of a small private plane, with the word improvisation used to describe the pilot's attempt at an emergency landing. Luna shook her head, trying to rationalize. These were just coincidences, distant echoes of her trauma. One particularly cold autumn day, Luna was walking home after a rehearsal at the conservatory. Maple leaves cascaded in reds and golds around her. The landscape was idyllic, and for a moment, Luna allowed herself to feel genuine peace. She passed over a small wooden bridge spanning a stream, the sound of the water gurgling softly beneath her. Suddenly, a sound. Not a crash, not a scream. Something much subtler. A crack. A sound she knew from the Carnegie Hall vision, a sound of wood giving way under tension. Luna stopped in the middle of the bridge, her heart leaping in her chest. She looked around, but saw nothing. The stream continued its tranquil course. It's paranoia, she whispered to herself, trying to calm her nerves. It's fine. She took a step forward. And then, it came. Not a violent collapse, but a final act of cruel irony. The ground beneath her didn't fully give way. Only a single plank, right in the center of the bridge, where she stepped, came loose from one side. Luna lost her footing. In an instinctive, flight, reflex, she tried to grab the wooden railing. But the railing, old and rotted, disintegrated in her hands. She tried again, desperately, to move her feet, to find support, just as she had done in that alley in New York, seeking a quick and unexpected route. Death had learned its lesson. Luna fell. Not a long fall. Just enough for her head to hit the sharp rock of the stream below with a muffled scream. The sound was almost inaudible, lost in the murmur of the water. And silence fell over the environment. The leaves continued to fall, the water to flow, as if nothing had happened. Fate, patient and cruel, finally completed its cycle. The melody of death, which had found its first dark note in the collapse of Carnegie Hall, now resonated in a final solo, soft and inescapable. Luna, the musician who heard the symphonies of destiny, had become the last note of her own funeral song. Death always wins.